don't think I came out from under a chair for a very long time.
Camilla just went against every royal protocol and did something shocking and completely unexpected. She's the Queen of England, sitting at the very top of the royal family. But now she's starting a podcast, just like any other celebrity out there. Why is she doing this now? Is she trying to pretend to be one of the people? And what is her podcast even about? Camilla is out there doing things that no Queen of England has ever done before her. And that apparently means starting a podcast, which is just about the most unexpected thing she could do. I mean, Camilla can be pretty unpredictable at times, but a queen starting a podcast is completely unheard of. And the thing is, you can't just help but think this has to be severely against royal protocol. The royal family is all about being proper and not saying much. Half the time with royal appearances, the royals just wave at the camera and don't even say a single word. They don't talk openly to the public, ever. Definitely not openly enough for a podcast to work. Not to mention that just having a podcast in the first place could be against royal protocol. But Camilla is doing it anyway. And to be fair, she's not actually the first royal we've seen start a podcast. Harry and Meghan had a whole podcast deal with Spotify. And to be fair, that didn't really go well for them. The deal was honestly a massive disaster, if anything. But they still ended up making a podcast, even if it was just the one. Which was, of course, Meghan's podcast, Archetypes. It only ran for 12 episodes before it was canceled and never came back. That still makes Meghan a royal with a podcast. But the thing is, she had it after she and Harry left the royal family. By that point, they weren't working royals and they weren't even living in the UK anymore. It actually made sense for Meghan to have a podcast when she did. Unlike Camilla right now, that just makes no sense at all. There are other royals who have dabbled in podcasting too, but none of them did it while also being working royals. Princess Eugenie has a podcast called Floodlight, where she and her co-host talk with guests about fighting modern slavery. But Eugenie has never actually been a working royal. And then there's her mother, Sarah Ferguson, aka Fergie. She also had a podcast at one point called Tea Talks with the Duchess and Sarah. The Sarah in the name was actually her co-host, Sarah Thompson. But ever since she divorced Prince Andrew, Fergie hasn't even officially been a member of the royal family. Things like royal protocol don't even apply to her at this point, so there's nothing wrong with her having a podcast. And then there's Mike Tyndall. He's the husband of Princess Anne's daughter, Zara. And even though he is technically a royal, it's a pretty distant connection. It's definitely not like we hear about Mike Tyndall a lot when talking about the royal family. Although his podcast does actually feature other royals sometimes. This year, he had on not only his mother-in-law, Princess Anne, but also William and Kate. But most of the time, his podcast actually has nothing to do with the royals. It's called The Good, the Bad, and the Rugby. And as the name suggests, it's all about rugby. Mike actually used to be a professional rugby player before he retired, so it makes perfect sense for him to have a podcast about rugby. He's also never been a working royal, and he's only really in the family by extension. His position in the royal family is miles away from Camilla's right now. In fact, none of the royals who have had a podcast were ever as high up in the royal family as she is. Meghan is definitely the closest one, especially when it comes to the amount of media attention that's been on her. Her position in the royal family hasn't really been all that different from Fergie or even Eugenie, but ever since she married Harry, she's been at the center of all the royal gossip. Still, even before she left the royal family, she was never as high up as Camilla is now. And back when she announced Archetypes, she still got a lot of backlash for starting a podcast. That really puts into perspective just how wild it is for Camilla to do that now. I mean, she's the queen. She's second in command only to Charles. And none of the other royals were even working for the royal family when they had their podcast. But when Camilla decides she wants to do something, that thing is what she does. Her podcast idea is actually something of a book club. It's called The Queen's Reading Room, and it's exactly what you would expect. There's a lot of talking about books and also some interviews with famous authors, which just seems like a wildly random thing for Camilla to start a podcast about. At least until you realize that she actually has a charity that's all about books and reading too. Her charity is called The Reading Room, a very similar name to the podcast. But that's because the podcast is actually a sort of side product of the charity. It's just one of the initiatives they came up with to promote the joy and wonder of reading, which is something the charity apparently aims to do. So at least now we know where the idea came from for Camilla to have a podcast. And she's not even actually hosting it alone. The main host of the podcast is actually Vicky Perrin, the CEO of Camilla's reading charity. But even then, Camilla is still heavily involved in the podcast. podcast. And most importantly, her name is all over it. To the public, for all intents and purposes, Queen Camilla now has a podcast. And I just can't believe the royal family media team and even Charles allowed that, except if they were the ones who came up with it in the first place. Charles has been trying to modernize the monarchy for ages, and maybe they thought having the Queen host a podcast was a good way to do that. And I mean, it's definitely a way to do something, but the effect might not be as good for the royal family as they're all probably hoping, especially because, as someone pointed out on Reddit, giving Camilla a podcast actually makes them hypocrites. The reason goes all the way back to when Meghan was still trying to fit into the royal family, and they were doing everything in their power to push her out. One of the things they said about her was that she's just too Hollywood. Obviously, being an actor, Meghan wasn't used to being proper and dignified all the time, not in the royal way at least. And her more open and genuine way of being was one of the biggest things they criticized about her. But now that it's been a few years, they're turning around and doing the exact same thing they bashed Meghan for. Having a podcast definitely is a Hollywood thing to do, but when it benefits them, suddenly the royal family has no problem with being a little Hollywood themselves. It's actually very possible that they're jealous of how much media attention Meghan is getting. Even experts and inside sources have been saying that the high-up royals are unhappy about not getting enough press, especially in comparison to Harry and Meghan. It's starting to make sense that Camilla's podcast could actually be a plan by the royal marketing team to get more media attention on the royal family. It would definitely explain a lot. Although it seems like a wild plan since we are talking about the royal family, but maybe it's not actually a ploy to modernize the monarchy at all. Maybe Camilla just wanted to have a podcast, so she started one. We all know that she would have the power to do that, even if her personal image team disagreed. After all, when was the last time Camilla couldn't do something she wanted? Anyway, what do you guys think? Why do you think Camilla's starting a podcast? Do you think it's a good idea? Let me know in the comments below.